Good evening, everyone. So it's 6 o'clock right now. I know that we'll have people trickling in as the evening continues, but I want to be cognizant of your time. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today. This is the meeting on how to get predictable development outcomes. Specifically, we're going to be discussing form-based codes and how they're really useful tools to actually get more predictable and high quality development. But before we get started, I'll go ahead and do some introductions. My name's Luisa Leite. I'm a project manager and town planner with Dover Cole & Partners. Been working with Neptune Beach since 2019 now. We also have a couple other team members on the line with us. If you all just want to say hello, Brenda. We also have Bill Spakowski online, who's helping us with the comp plan and the code.
Good evening, everyone.
And from the city, we have Christina Wright and Stefan Nguyen, as well as Councilmember Chin.
Hello, good evening.
Great. And so with that, I'll go ahead and get started. This meeting is being recorded. We know people have a lot of prior engagements and maybe aren't able to make it live, or if there's something you missed or didn't understand, you want to see it again, we'll be posting this meeting, like all meetings, on the website for you to be able to see it at any time. So please share it with any friends who couldn't make it if they're interested in this topic and want to learn more. This is a webinar format. You can click the Q&A button if you have questions. We'll have plenty of time at the end of the meeting to answer any questions you have. I think if we're a smaller group, you can also just raise your hand and we'll actually let you, say your questions and comments out loud. But you can always type it in as well. So right now we'll be covering the overall timeline and process. We'll do a quick poll to see who all has joined. And then we'll go into what a form-based code is, what are the different elements that are in a typical form-based code, and then how that kind of code can actually lead to more predictable results. So we've had a couple of public meetings already in December. We did an introduction to comprehensive planning and land development regulations. We also did a residential density meeting, and there was a community resilience planning workshop, and that was all in December. This month and the first week of March, we have a couple of other workshops and meetings, this one about predictable development outcomes. Importantly, next Monday, we'll be doing a City Council and CDB code framework workshop, and that's to kind of set the basis of how much of the existing land development regulations we will be updating and what type of code we should be implementing when we go about doing those updates. That's what we'll be discussing at that meeting. There will be a secondary community resilience planning workshop also next week on Tuesday. And then the following week, there'll be a meeting about site design standards and building height, as well as architectural guidelines. You can learn all about the events and register on the on the project website, neptunebeachvisionplan.com/events. Again, I just remind everyone who's joined us that this is part 2 of a 3-phase project. Really, it's phases 2 and 3 of a 3-phase project. We'll be doing the updated comprehensive plan and the updated land development code in parallel. And we're just getting started. We're in these winter meetings and workshops, and we have a lot going on. We've started working on the first draft of the comprehensive plan update as well. That's happening in parallel, but there's lots of other opportunities in the coming months and throughout the summer to give us input and to stay involved. All right, so I will turn it over to Brenda. She's just going to do a really quick poll to see who is attending, and just to do some instructions of how that works. If you all haven't done this yet, all you have to do is get your cell phone, and what you'll do is text Dover Cole 516 to 22333, and that will let you enter the poll. And so all the answers you'll be submitting through text message on your phones.
And if you
Again,
have any questions or are having issues, let us know in the chat and we can walk you through it. So feel free to do that if you need to, but this is using your phone, and you send the number 22333. That's who you're sending the message to, and the message is Dover Cole 516. You'll also see it at the top of your screen when we share the questions. All right, so I'm going to share that now. Okay, so the first question is, have you participated in previous community vision plan events? And this could also include any previous winter workshops that we started with in December. So you send the text A if you participated, or B if this is your first event. And we're not seeing anyone doing it yet. I don't know if anyone's having issues. You can send us a chat, let us know.
remember to enter the poll, you have to text Dover Cole 516 to the number 22333. Is it open, Brenda? Is it accepting?
Yes.
It's sending me to register, just so you know.
Oh, is it?
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
it's doing that too.
Okay, hold on. Let me see.
you shouldn't have to register. So we'll
Yeah, you shouldn't.
don't register. We will try and fix that. Brenda, why don't we keep going and we can come back to this?
Yeah.
And then we'll have probably more people later on. So
Yeah, sounds
again,
good.
these were some intro questions just to see who's joining us and if you've been involved in any of these meetings up till now and where you live in Neptune Beach. So we'll come back to those. But I'll go ahead and keep going. We'll start with what is a form-based code? So a form-based code is a type of land use regulation, a newer type of land use regulation. But then there's a couple of different types of land use regulations and zoning. So there's conventional or Euclidean zoning, which is single use zoning. It divides a given city or community into very specific single use zones. So the organizing principle of conventional zoning is use. That's what you're using to actually organize the different districts throughout the city. And you use tools like permitted use, density, floor area ratio, setbacks, parking requirements, and maximum building height to inform what kind of development will occur in each district. Now, you can add what are called design guidelines to conventional zoning, and that gives you a little bit more of an ability to inform the design and specifications of the actual building, especially how the building looks from the outside. But I'll note that design guidelines are typically encouraged, so they're not regulatory. So it's not a way to guarantee a certain type of building necessarily. Now, form-based code is unique because the organizing principle is not use, rather it's the building's form and actual character or place type. So instead of permitted use, density, and setbacks, you have tools like different street and building types or a certain mix of types, build to lines, the number of floors, and a specific percentage of site frontage or lot coverage. And we're going to go through each of these elements in more detail. But the primary thing to take away is that whereas conventional zoning is organized by allowable uses, form-based codes are organized by building form and place types. And here you can see that pretty clearly. Conventional land use codes, use and density is the primary organizing factor. Whereas in form-based codes, it's really the form and what the building looks like and how it relates to the streets and public spaces that is most important. So I'm just going to compare a couple of aspects of conventional codes versus form-based codes. So conventional codes focuses again on uses and dimensional requirements for each lot. Whereas form-based codes, like I've mentioned, it focuses on physical form of the actual development and the relationship of buildings to the street. The zones in conventional codes are based on uses and density, whereas the zones in form-based codes are based on character. So instead of a single family neighborhood, it could be a traditional neighborhood. Or instead of a central business district, it may be a downtown. But you're really focusing on the type of character of the community that you want to build, as opposed to the allowable uses in that area. In conventional codes, you apply pretty uniform setback, height, lot size, and dimensional requirements for each zone. And in form-based codes, you can allow or prohibit specific types of buildings in each zones, and then apply setbacks, lot sizes, and height standards, which many times are known as build-to lines, for each actual building type. So you're deciding the types of buildings you'd like to allow in each of the districts, as opposed to just the uses. Conventional codes allow a limited variety of uses in each zone, with the exception being mixed-use zoning districts and conventional codes, whereas form-based codes allow a wider variety of uses in each zone, but ties these to a specific and appropriate building type that fits within the character of that given zone. Now, that doesn't mean you can't restrict the uses. You can still decide what types of uses are allowed. It's just not the primary organizing element of the code. Conventional codes also use minimum setbacks to create building envelopes, but the ultimate location and form of a building is unpredictable. And we'll show you some images that clearly show that in just a second. Form-based codes use something called build-to lines, which are essentially a minimum and maximum front and corner side setback. So it gives you a much more predictable place for where the building is actually going to sit on the lot and in relationship to the street. Conventional codes don't typically address design of public realm. That means the streets, trails, parks, and natural areas, whereas form-based codes incorporate detailed standards for the design of streets and public spaces. They also differ in how they define a parcel. In conventional codes, a parcel is defined by setbacks, parking requirements, and maximum building height, whereas in form-based codes, it's defined by street and building types, build-to lines, minimum and maximum height, usually in floors, but it doesn't have to be in floors, and the types of building frontages and facade, and the facade width along the street. So just to compare, this is an area near South Miami where you can see a building that was constructed on the left with the old conventional zoning code that allowed commercial and office buildings with very little prescription on how that building meets the street, meets the sidewalk. And then there was a form-based code implemented, and you can see the development on the right hand of the screen, how that development has actually responded to the requirements of the new form-based code. So there is prescriptions for the amount of real doors and windows and transparency, where there had to be habitable space on the balconies. There was also standards for how the building actually is sited towards the street, towards the sidewalk, how it has continuous covered walkways along the property lines as well. So this is a similar example, again, just to show kind of the old and new regulations side by side. So not allowing things like large blank walls along streets, but really creating a type of building that engages with the street and the public realm in a more meaningful way and a more controlled way. So a form-based code has several elements. Just to show you what an actual code may look like, on the left is a regulating plan, which is a form-based code's equivalent to a zoning map. It's much more detailed than a zoning map. So the area you see on the left, in a traditional conventional code, that would probably be painted all with one color, say central business district. In a form-based code, and in a regulating plan, you're able to get much more fine grain zones than you would in a conventional code. And that allows you to get much more specific about where certain building types and building forms would actually apply along specific streets and say adjacent to public parks or open spaces. So you get a much more fine grained result than you can get with conventional zoning codes. And each of these different districts that are colored in a regulating plan correspond to what we call a transect. And so the diagram on the right is the natural to urban transect. It's inspired by biological systems. And so it's showing you the full range of different place types and characters from rural to urban. Now, what these actually mean is different for every community. So a T4 general urban zone might look one way in New York City, and it would probably look very different in a city like Neptune Beach. And so that's the part of the process we get to, is defining the full range of transects and then what the actual standards look like for each of those transects in the specific community that we're working in. So like I said, a T6 in Neptune Beach will look quite different than a T6 in Chicago or New York or anywhere else, really. So you have to then define and personalize the actual building form standards and street standards to apply to the unique character of each place. But think of these as a range of intensity and types of development, from the most natural and rural and suburban to the most active and urban. So each of those transect zones, like I mentioned, has corresponding building form standards. And so every zoning code has some version of development standards. They're usually all written in text with very few images and diagrams to actually explain what all of those standards mean or look like in reality. And one of the key elements of a form-based code is actually illustrating what all those numbers and rules and regulations would actually mean on a specific parcel. And so here's a T4 zoning district, and you can see that they're illustrating exactly the minimum lot width and the minimum lot depth, but also the type of building, the different types of facades that are allowed in this district, whether it be a wall with a forecourt or a dooryard or a gallery. Those are called frontage types, which are things you can be very specific in outlining in the code exactly what types of frontages you want to allow in a particular district. So why is it important to update land development regulations? There's many reasons. One of the most important is to facilitate the type of development that the community wants and values, while prohibiting development that detracts from the overall character. And so here are two great examples in downtown of developments, both new development and renovation, that add a lot to the community character. So how can we make the code work to ensure that we get these kind of results that really enhance the quality of life and character of Neptune Beach? So I'm going to go now through the actual elements of the form-based code. There's 5 key elements that must be included in any form-based code. The first one that I already mentioned is a regulating plan. So this is the actual map that designates specific zones, transect zones, which then apply to different building form standards. Then there's a public space and street standards. These specify elements in the public realm, the sidewalk, travel lanes, on-street parking, trees, urban furniture. Like I mentioned, form-based codes have a lot more detail in actually shaping how the public realm and public spaces look. Then there are the building standards. These are actually the controls that allow you to set specific building types, frontage types, building form standards that will essentially predict what kinds of development are allowed in these different, more fine-grained zones. There's administration, which I'll say every code, including a conventional code, has some section on administration that clearly defines and explains the process for pursuing an application and building a new project and the entire review process. And then finally, there has to be a section on definitions. So I'll go through these one by one. I've already spoke a bit about the regulating plan. Here's another example. Again, it's important to emphasize how much more fine-grained regulating plans are in comparison to regular zoning maps. You can be much more specific about the kinds of development you want to allow fronting certain public spaces or along certain streets. It's a question that came up a lot during the vision plan process, particularly in the discussions about 500 Atlantic. Would the rules for 500 Atlantic have to apply uniformly throughout a site of that size? And the great thing about form-based codes is you can break down larger areas into very specific elements, and you don't have to have the same rules for every single street, every single corner, every single lot of that area. You can really be very specific, and within a pretty small area have up to 3 or 4 different transect zones with different building form standards that apply. Here's an example of some of the public space street standards you might find in a form-based code. Here's a typical street section, and there's a corresponding table with specific standards on how wide the travel lanes should be, how wide the bioswales or planting areas should be between sidewalk dining areas and parked cars or travel lanes. Again, we can get into a lot of specificity with how we want public spaces and streets to look. And the same can be said for the building standards. So again, there's lots of elements to actually putting together the building standards in a form-based code. The most important thing to keep in mind is that these are always visual. So it's very clear and easy to use when you open up and see your transect zone where your property is. You can kind of very quickly understand what the rules are, what the build to lines or setbacks are, and what are the permissible frontage types. Finally, there's administration. One of the goals of form-based codes are to be as streamlined as possible in the application and review process. So the reason why it's so prescriptive and so specific is precisely so that the community knows ahead of time what development will look like. And developers or property owners who are building, they know that if they do what the form-based code has laid out, and if they follow all the standards that have been put in place, that they will be approved, essentially. So it's trying to minimize the amount of negotiation and the needs for variances by having both the applicants and the community and the city have a much clearer idea of what's actually possible on any given site. And of course, there's a long section on definitions, which, like I said, every single zoning code, whether it's a form-based code or not, does need to have. So there are some optional elements that you can include in a form-based code. And all of these will only give you more control over the actual quality and outcome of development. The first one, which is worth noting, are architectural standards. So these are standards above and beyond the building form standards that apply to any given transect zone that will actually control the architectural style. So a lot of times in building form standards, we're talking about the relationship of a building to the street, the overall form and massing of the site, but we're not necessarily getting into architectural style. There are communities that are very interested in having more uniform look or historic look, and they have a set of different architectural styles that are permitted in given areas of the city. And that's something that if that's desirable, it's certainly something you could add to a form-based code to have even more predictable results. There are also landscaping standards, which many conventional codes also have in some form or another that you can use to regulate the design and types of plants that are appropriate. There's signage standards, environmental resource standards, and finally annotations. And I'll quickly go through these. Here's an example of what the architectural standards could look like. You can, be very explicit about the actual architectural styles that are permitted, but you can also get very specific into the actual expression of the building with center lines and different expression lines and cornices, and kind of exactly the type of building that will result. And these can be as loose or strict as the community desires. And here are some examples of landscaping standards, both for streets and public spaces, but also on private properties, in particular places like parking lots. How do we shield those? How many trees do you need, etc. Signage standards, there's a lot of new state and federal regulation around regulating signs. And so that's something that's, changed in the last couple of years. And so we know that's something we have to look at, in particular with Neptune Beach's existing signage standards, to make sure that they're all in compliance with statutory requirements. But this is another thing that can be updated through a form-based code. And again, trying to make it as visual as possible with lots of examples and illustrations of what's permitted. And environmental resource standards, these help regulate stormwater management and site design criteria. Again, this is something you would find in some capacity in most conventional codes as well. This just, in a form-based code, you would also have them, and they can be, as comprehensive or not as the community desires. So how does a form-based code actually lead to more predictable results? This is really why we're here today, to discuss this exact question. And so I want to compare or contrast some of what I just showed you with what are the conventional tools that are typically used to control building form and bulk and intensity. So conventional codes regulate development intensity with 4 primary tools. One is land use. Another is floor area ratio, which is the total building area divided by the lot area. And then there's density, which is the number of units per acre, and building height. But what these diagrams show, I'll start with the diagram on the left, that's actually showing density. You can have a piece of property, say 1 acre, that these diagrams are showing, that have the exact same density, 30 units per acre, and still get 3 developments that look very different from each other. The same can be said for floor area ratio. The 3 diagrams on the upper right, all of them have a floor area ratio of 1 to 1. But depending on the lot coverage, you can get very, very different results. So neither of these are great predictors of exactly what a certain development will look like. Just to illustrate that point again, these are 2 photos of areas that from a regulatory standpoint are almost identical. These have the same exact land use, single family residential, the same density, 4 dwelling units per acre, and similar building heights. And yet, the results are vastly different. I mean, why, what regulations might we be able to tweak to ensure that we get neighborhoods that look more like the picture on the right rather than the picture on the left? And there's regulations for the placement of garage doors. I mean, this neighborhood clearly has what appears to be build-to lines. You can see that the buildings are coming up closer to the sidewalk and actually meet the sidewalk with a particular frontage. In this case, these are porches. It could be stoops. And, there's different frontages you could require for certain areas to get a more inviting street. Here are some other built results that you can compare. This is in Higgins Beach, Massachusetts. They applied a form-based code, and you can see some of the residential development that they got prior to the form-based code, and then some of the homes that were built after the form-based code. And again, from a regulatory perspective, these weren't so different before, but you can see that some of the homes on the left, you were getting strange proportions, very skinny homes, bases to the buildings that didn't meet the street, no kind of openings or windows or doors where you might want them. Whereas the homes on the right, again, are meeting the street and the public realm in a much more meaningful and controlled way. So like I mentioned, conventional codes, they pretty much stop in this first image on the left. They give you a general buildable area. You have a minimum setback from the side of your lot, from the back, and from the front. But that leaves a large area on which to place a building. One thing that form-based codes do, like I've mentioned, is they might have a minimum and a maximum setback, or what's known to as a build-to area. So that basically guarantees that the building is going to have to be placed somewhere along that build-to line, which is that darker blue band on the illustration in the center. That narrows the actual buildable area significantly compared to a conventional zone and gets you much more predictable results. It also has a lot more standards of exactly where the parking might be located, where garage doors can face, but it doesn't stop there, of course. Form-based codes can have much more specific regulations on primary massings versus secondary massings, primary and secondary fronts to any particular street, upper story projections, second and third floors if they're able to project forward. And the list goes on and on. There's a whole number of tools you can use within a form-based code to be very specific about how the massing of the building will shape on any lot. And here again are some different examples for fronts of buildings as well as building additions. So if you have a side wing addition, what that might look like, or a rear addition, projecting storefronts, different kinds of roof lines as well. Additional standards for building facades, and like I mentioned already, roof features. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we have a number of frontage standards. So this applies to different transect zones. The images you're seeing are for a more urban environment that has active ground floor uses, commercial ground floor uses. And there's a number of different ways that the ground floor would be able to meet the street, whether there's a dining patio or front garden or some kind of gallery or second floor balcony. And for shop fronts, you can also be very prescriptive on the amount of transparency on the ground level. If it's residential, how high the finished floor must be on the first story. And you can also set very specific building types that are actually allowed in each transect zone. And this is very, very useful. Instead of just regulating the use, single family or duplexes, you can say specifically allow a type like a cottage court or a townhome or a mixed use building or a traditional shopfront. And there's a whole list of building types that you can define, illustrate, and then apply to any particular transect zone. And the goal of putting all these regulations together, the end goal is to get neighborhoods and places that feel cohesive, that feel natural, that really encourage walkability and bikeability, and comfortable places for people to be and walk, and great places for people to have businesses that are attractive and successful as well. And so I mentioned these two examples at the very beginning of the meeting, and I'll bring them up again. And from all we've heard in the vision plan process, these are two developments that came up often in conversations as, successful development projects, redevelopment projects in Neptune Beach. And we were struck by the fact that both of these actually required variances to be built as they are today. Actually, the Hawkers building had a total of 8 variances and a special exception to get the dining that you see in this photograph, the outdoor dining. And that's really why updating land development regulations is so important. We want to make sure that the things that the community likes and desires are actually not only possible under the zoning regulations and land development regulations, but encouraged. So developers shouldn't and property owners shouldn't have to jump through a lot of hoops or request a bunch of variances to do a project that the community actually likes and wants. So there's still some things that need to be defined in the land development regulation update. Form-based codes can be applied to a variety of different areas and at a variety of different scales. So typically, municipalities will apply them to a specific downtown area or along a deteriorating strip commercial corridor. They'll apply them to large undeveloped areas. Potentially, they can create a floating form-based code that's optional for developers to use in certain areas. Or they can apply them to existing neighborhoods where there's some infill development potential or where they're trying to preserve and extend a specific historic or existing character. You can also apply them to an entire city or municipality or even to a county and region. Now, it's not a foregone conclusion that we should or have to do a form-based code for Neptune Beach. And that will be the focus of our meeting on Monday, to actually explain and walk through some different alternatives for how the city might update its land development regulations and zoning. One of the options is certainly to pursue a form-based code, and how we proceed all depends on the priorities of staff and the community and elected officials. Form-based codes are particularly good at getting predictable results and ensuring a certain quality and character of development. If we move forward with a form-based code, there's a couple of different ways it could interact with the existing regulations in place. One way is to do a comprehensive replacement. You replace the underlying zoning districts today with a new form-based code. You could also do a hybrid zoning code, where some of the zoning districts are replaced with form-based districts, but they live side by side along other existing districts as well. And like I mentioned, you can also do an optional or a parallel code, where all of the underlying zoning remains the same, but developers are given the option to build under a new form-based code without actually having to rezone the property. The optional parallel code is really only, it really makes sense if there's large undeveloped parcels of land or empty vacant parcels of land. This is probably not the most likely case for a community and city like Neptune Beach. I think a hybrid zoning code will be the most logical way forward if the city wants to implement a form-based code. So like I mentioned, we'll be discussing and trying to define the actual scope of the land development regulations update at the City Council and CDB Code Framework Workshop on Monday. That's this Monday, the 22nd, from 6 to 8. That meeting will be both virtual and in person at First Christian Church. And the goal of that meeting is to really define which areas of Neptune Beach we should be looking at and should be updating, and what that update would look like, whether it would be a form-based code or maybe it's just strategic revisions to the existing and underlying zoning districts, potentially adding design guidelines. So there's a couple of different alternatives we'll be exploring, and we'll be going through the pros and cons of each of those if you are interested in that. But with that, I will open it up to Q&A. If you have any questions about what form-based codes are, where they've been used, how that might work for Neptune Beach or not, we're happy to answer those questions. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the Q&A.
Louisa, do you want to see if we could do the polling?
Yes,
Maybe a couple more people
absolutely.
joined us. So Maybe we could go back to that slide that kind of instructs people how to do it.
Yes.
Thank you. So
All right.
remember, if you have any questions too, in the meantime, send the questions in the Q&A button or raise your hand and we can unmute you so you can ask the questions. All right, so for those that are a little new, to join the polling, you send a message to the number 22333. That message is Dover Cole 516, as you see on the screen. And you'll be able to join the polling. And you just text your answers as the questions pop up. So I'm going to share my screen now and show that. First question. The first question is, have you participated in previous community vision plan events? Okay, so it's working now. I see that. So we don't have any newcomers. Welcome back, everyone.
Yes. This is the A team, our most engaged.
All right, I'm going to lock it in 3, 2, 1. And the next question. Where do you live? East of 3rd, west of Penman Road, between Penman and 3rd Street, other beaches community, greater Jacksonville area, or outside of Jacksonville? Okay. So when it slows down, I'll go ahead and lock it in 3, 2, 1. Next question. What is your age? So as you know, since you've participated before, we like to see who's in the room and what type of engagement we've been getting. That's great. A little bit of everything. Okay, so I'm going to lock it in 3, 2, 1. Next question. What is your zip code? So this one, you just type in the numbers and it'll show up on here.
This is training for Monday night's meeting.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be asking a lot more questions on Monday, since that workshop is meant to be more interactive, and we're really curious to get the community's feedback, specifically on which areas of Neptune Beach you would want to see any kind of land development regulation updates or revisions. So you can consider this practice.
So the bigger number is the one that most people have inputted, answered. And then, like Louisa said, next week we'll have more questions and they'll be open-ended. So you can actually send full sentences and questions. So please come back for that. And that's it. So we can start the Q&A.
So there aren't too many questions. There was one answered. We've gotten questions about that we're trying to recommend to change zoning to allow more residential development. And I'll answer that to everyone. We are not recommending anything at the moment. We're simply trying to explain one tool or one way that the city could update its zoning to get more predictable results. So again, nothing we talked about today is actually about specific land uses, be it residential or mixed use or commercial. This is about how developments, whether it's a single family home or a new commercial building in the town center, what that looks like. So we know in the existing codes that to get developments or projects like Hawkers, those actually aren't permitted by right. It took several variances to get a project like that built. And so we want to make sure that the types of development that the community does like and does want are permitted in the zoning. And beyond that, if there's a specific character in a neighborhood that you want to preserve or encourage more of, that's something a form-based code is really good at delivering. If there are specific architectural styles, more specific street standards and public space standards, those are all things we can look at updating and revising either through a form-based code or through more strategic updates to the existing zoning. So we're getting a couple more questions. Let's see the open ones. So there's a question on when we decide what areas are form-based versus traditional code. So that's the entire goal of Monday's workshop with council and the Community Development Board. So today was an introduction into what a form-based code is, since we'll be discussing the possibility of form-based codes on Monday. And we wanted people to have the ability to ask questions about exactly what it is, how it works, how it's different from, conventional zoning, so that on Monday we can have a discussion about exactly what areas need updates based on some of the underlying issues we've been hearing throughout this process. And then what type of code or revision should actually happen. So it could be that a form-based code is appropriate for one neighborhood, but that doesn't mean we have to use a form-based code or form-based code elements in other areas. So the goal of Monday night's workshop is really to discuss that with council, with the CDB, and with the public to get an idea of what the best tools and revisions will be moving forward. So form-based code, there's a question here about what the difference between form-based code and mixed-use development is. And like I mentioned, form-based code is unique in that it's less about the actual use. You can still regulate the uses however you want. If you don't want to allow mixed uses, you can regulate that through a form-based code. What the form-based code does is actually regulate the actual form and aesthetics of the building and how the building relates to the street and creates a more walkable and inviting place to be. That's what the form-based code is particularly good at. It's also a much easier document for people to use because it is very visual. So the uses permitted inside the building are absolutely still regulated through a form-based code, just as they are through your existing zoning code. And that doesn't need to change in any way. But in order to get more predictable results and get development that's going to look a certain way from the outside, regardless of what uses are inside, that's why you may want to pursue a form-based code. There's a question here, can't we just adjust the cosmetics and add those into the existing zoning instead of a whole new project? And the answer is yes, that is a possibility, and one will present on Monday as well. It's not a foregone conclusion that Neptune Beach needs a whole new form-based code, or at least a partially new code for a certain area. We could introduce things like design guidelines into the existing zoning districts as an added kind of guide to architectural style and building forms. That is another option. We could also tweak the actual existing development standards included in the zoning districts that exist today. So there's a couple of different options, and we'll be going through those kind of one by one on Monday to see why we might do one versus the other. All right. Were there any other questions, Bill or Brenda, that you saw that maybe you wanted to repeat? I think we got them all.
Yeah, it looks like we did.
there's a question or more of a comment here that, you know, we really want to preserve what's unique about Neptune Beach. We don't want our city to look like other cities. And I think that's a great point. It's something we've heard a lot throughout this process. And I'd say that that's actually one of the strengths of a form-based code is you can regulate what a certain area will look like by being much more prescriptive. And when I say prescriptive, a form-based code is prescriptive in that it's saying through the regulations what you want something to look like, whereas conventional codes are proscriptive in that they say, well, these are the things you can't do, but it doesn't necessarily tell you the things you want to see. And so that's the key difference. And if you take anything away from, I think, to explain the difference in a form-based code, you can be very specific about the things you want to see, instead of just prohibiting certain things that aren't allowed. So if there's a specific character, be it historic character, that you want to preserve, that's something that you can do very effectively through a form-based code. Though you could also, you know, revise the underlying development standards already existing in the code, and you can add on top of that additional design guidelines to help inform, you know, the result of development as well.
Bill, do you want to answer the next question? Oh, you're on mute.
There's a question about whether form-based codes can specify that buildings should be consistent with existing buildings. That's actually a technique more common in conventional codes. The problem with it is if what's next to you is a, let's say, an abandoned lot or abandoned building, then you're being required to, you know, somehow match that. And if your goal is to have all the buildings on the street look about the same, which is, you know, usually a pretty good goal, you really want to say what that is rather than let the fact that there's a vacant lot next to you affect what you're allowed to build. So, you know, there are times we use a technique like that, but generally it's not the best way to achieve what you're looking for.
Yeah, the better method, just to add to that, is to understand what it is about existing buildings in a given area that you like as a community, be it the architectural style, the height, the frontage of it, how it faces the sidewalk, the colors, whatever it is about certain buildings or homes in your neighborhood that you like, figure out what those elements are, and then actually include that in the development standards for new buildings in that district. All right. Well, I think we're you know, just at time. We wanted this to be a shorter meeting. So, you know, like I said, this will be online and available to you all to watch, to send to friends, to rewatch if you have any questions. Sorry, I'm giving you whiplash here. Just want to get to the end and remind you that we still have upcoming meetings. Like I said, on Monday, that one is particularly important. We really recommend you all attending and telling your friends, telling your neighbors to attend. It won't be the last time you can get involved, but it really help kind of set up what the framework of any future zoning changes will be. And then we have a second community resilience planning workshop the following next week as well, and the following week some shorter meetings like this one to talk more specifically about different types of site design standards and how to measure building height, a couple of different ways on how to measure building height.
Louisa, can you share your screen?
Oh, yes.
Seeing the
Sorry.
calendar or the schedule.
Sorry.
One more question Bill wants to answer.
Sure. Go
Thank
ahead,
you.
Bill.
There's a question about whether the Neptune Beach would need some kind of new software technology. to create overlay codes. No, there's not. The code, whatever type of code is, whether it's a conventional code or form-based or something in between, it'll be a code that's written on paper with illustrations and also available online, like pretty much all codes are these days. If you prefer to print out a paper and read it sitting, on your couch at home, or review it online, it'll be available either way, but it does not require technology training in order to understand the code.
Yep. If you're interested in getting into more specifics about the types of design standards or types of architectural standards, then I would recommend joining the meetings on the first week of March to talk specifically about that. And we'll have some questions, asking the styles and types of architecture and building elements that you like or don't like. So be sure to come back for that. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you all again. I'll be there in person on Monday, and have a great evening. Thanks so much.